Hi guys, welcome back to the Shannon Show. Hello if you're new. So today's video is going to be a review of Normal People, which just dropped on BBC Three and BBC iPlayer and will be made available very soon on Hulu for those of you watching in the US. So the series is based on the book of the same name written by Sally Rooney, and the author actually did have an input in the script for this series. I personally haven't read the book, so I was going into this with no real expectations in terms of comparing it to a book. But in terms of what I thought about it, I kind of just thought it was going to be a teen drama. There was going to be some highs, there was going to be some lows, and I was just expecting it to be a decent watch considering it's an adaptation of a best-selling book. So the main crux of the story is us following the lives of Mariam and Connor, who are romantically involved with each other but have a very turbulent relationship, and the highs and the lows and the problems and the issues with them as a couple as well as individual sees us through this series. The thing I'm going to talk about is the narrative. So obviously going into this series, Mariam and Connor are in their final years of secondary school and they're in this secret relationship. Mariam is from a well-off family, but she's ostracized in school because a lot of people think that because she comes from money, she thinks that she's better than everyone, and the fact that she's also intelligent as well. She's very snarky, she's cracking lots of jokes, she doesn't like to be patronised, and I was definitely here for her character, instantly warmed to her character. And obviously her love interest, Connor, he comes from a working class background. His mum is a domestic worker who works for Mariam's family, and he hangs around with people who are antagonistic to Mariam. And the whole reason why their relationship is secret is because Connor wants to make his life easy because he believes that if his friends find out that he is dating Mariam, they're just going to make his life hell for the remainder of secondary school. And he lets Mariam know this from the beginning, and Mariam seems to be on board. She's okay with the secrecy. And I think maybe she found it a bit of a turn on, you know, dirty little secret or whatever. Personally, I'm not a fan of such relationships, and I think that definitely set the rocky foundation of their relationship throughout the series. So even in the first episode, I wasn't really sure if I should be supporting this relationship, because even from the beginning there was still a lot of sweet parts of this relationship that, you know, in this kind of, okay, I've got to get into this fictional realm, I can get behind this relationship as such. But a bit of me is like, I'm not sure if Mariam is benefiting from this relationship the same way Connor is benefiting from this relationship. But I'd love to hear from people who have watched it. What did you think initially of Connor and Mariam's relationship and their whole relationship situation? I'd be very interested to hear. So at first things are going blissfully well. It seems like this arrangement is working out, but I think for me personally, I was hoping that this arrangement was going to turn into a public relationship for Mariam's sake. And it's a relationship that causes a lot of frustration, especially on Connor's part, because obviously Connor's friends are antagonistic to Mariam and they're just absolutely horrible for her. Obviously we know they're jealous of her. The way that they are so cruel to her, and everybody who's been through secondary school will be familiar with that type of cruelness because kids and teenagers are just ruthless. I feel like that is the most ruthless time for most people in their life, teenagehood. He's kind of just there, not really saying much. He doesn't get involved. He's not a dickhead in that way. He's a passive bystander, and I'm not sure what is worse. Am I meant to give him a pass because he didn't join in? But at the same time, he should have piped up. At first, Mariam could let it slide because she was kind of like, okay, this is a secret relationship, it's fine. And obviously that serious situation that went down in the club, she was kind of sick of their relationship and the secrecy of that relationship of that point. And that's when she was kind of just like, what am I actually doing here? What am I actually allowing here? And with this being her first relationship, it wasn't entirely, you know, a horrible relationship, but, you know, it wasn't the best relationship. Perhaps it was definitely had elements of Connor using Mariam. It definitely had elements of, you know, Mariam being used in this relationship by Connor. Set the tone for the relationships that we see her go through, because her relationships that are not with Connor just seem to all be a mess. I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. Is Connor the reason why Mariam keeps going for these horrible people? Or do you think it had something to do with Mariam's insecurity? Because even before they got together, she had issues with insecurities and her self-worth. So what do you think the reason was here? Do you think Connor is to blame per se for Mariam's horrible relationship? Or do you feel like she already had some stuff going on? The relationship between Connor and Mariam took us on quite a ride. And by the end of it, I'm not sure how I feel about them. By the end of it, Connor had matured. Connor even apologized sincerely to Mariam. He'd been helping Mariam out with her situation going on. But for me, I kind of feel like Connor is just the best person that has come along. Obviously, there could potentially be a door open for season 2. But in terms of if there is a season 2, if I'm hoping that they will get back together, I'm still not really sure if Connor has done enough to now be the ideal man for Miriam. But, he's the best romantic interest that Mariam has had, yes. But is he the best man for Mariam? I'm not so sure, but then again, I feel like Mariam has a dependency on companionship, specifically romantic companionship as well. The best thing in this series for Mariam to have would have just been single, because Mariam was really going through it with her romantic interest. It just seems like when you thought she was done with one trash guy, an even trashier guy pops out of the woodwork. That whole sub-storyline, like, I'm still like, what the hell were you doing? But yeah, so I have to ask, what did you guys think of that whole sub/abusive boyfriend storyline? It was a pretty well written series, but I feel like in terms of the weaker areas of the writing, I feel like this whole sub-storyline was definitely one of them. Personally, in real life, I'm not a big fan of that dynamic, but from what I do know, generally that dynamic, the most important part of that dynamic is consent and respect for each other's boundaries. And obviously in this relationship, we saw that her love interest became very abusive, would coerce Mariam to do things that she didn't want to do. And I think specifically that last scene, that photo shoot scene with her and the love interest was just so uncomfortable, and it was just so depressing. And I was just like, Mariam! I was just thinking like, Mariam, how did we get here? How did we get here, girl? It was just so sad. And I was just thinking, police. I'm very glad that Mariam got herself out of that relationship. That was definitely her worst relationship, I think. But I have to say, I wasn't entirely sold on the Dom becomes the abusive Dom storyline. I think maybe they just had to spice it up a little bit, because it was like, okay, we've had one abusive boyfriend, so we got to spice up the abuse a bit. That's kind of what that storyline felt to me, to be honest. And I feel like continuing on to that, the tone of the film, I feel like the beginning of the film starts off with promise. This relationship is probably not going to be on a high all of the time. There's going to be lows, but I kind of thought there was going to be a bit more balance of the lows and the highs in terms of the tone and the emotion. I feel like near the end, I don't think I smiled, laughed once. I feel like near the end, it just started to get really, really deep, really depressing. Every episode was just like, I don't want to watch this anymore. Like, I really just don't want to see Mariam going through it. I don't want to see Connor going through it. Difficult for me to watch emotionally, because I just knew it was just going to be so sad and depressing, and I was going to have to process those emotions. I don't necessarily think that was a bad thing. It definitely did its job. That was the tone of the film. It's meant to be sad. It's meant to be depressing. I was not expecting to be pulled in at that emotional level so intensely. And on that front, it does things beautifully. But if you're somebody who doesn't want to be in a depressed mood, you might have found it difficult to get through, especially if there's somebody who prefers to have something a bit more upbeat. Yeah, I definitely felt a lot of strong emotions, a lot of frustration for me. I didn't get like emotional in terms of upset. I can definitely imagine that a lot of people did get like emotional. A lot of people might have cried watching this. So yeah, I'd be interested to know if anybody did cry, or did you find it too hard or too difficult to watch because it was just so dark and depressing. The series does touch on a few issues in the show, but namely depression, especially like graduate depression, university depression. As somebody who graduated last year, I could definitely relate to some of the issues touched on, especially the issue that Connor had with where he belonged, being a working class student, having to function in a middle class environment, not really feeling like he belonged amongst them, imposter syndrome, things of that nature. You know, as a working class person who has been functioning literally my whole life in middle class area and environment, I could definitely relate to some of the conflicts that Connor had. Connor's relationships, I feel like all of his relationships kind of just felt like a filler for Mariam. I'm not really sure if he was ever invested or not thinking about Mariam. What did you guys think about Connor's girlfriend from university breaking up with him after he went through that really depressive after his friend committed suicide? Obviously, she gave her reasoning. She said, you know, she was trying to make their relationship work, but she just can't do it anymore. She has to think of herself. What did you guys think about that? Do you feel like the girlfriend was well within her rights to break off that relationship? Or do you feel like she was a little bit selfish for breaking up with Connor in this vulnerable time? I think she was justified in breaking up with Connor. I think, like she said, she tried. And I think it was at that point where it was starting to affect her own mental health. And I think, you always have to put your own mental health first. You can only support somebody so much. So I feel like it was justified. But what do you guys think? And in the conversations between him and his therapist, and definitely the conversations in the film was very dialogue heavy. We see a lot of therapeutic conversations going on between characters, mostly Connor and Marianne. And I think for the most part, they work really well in the series. At times it did feel like filler, and there was definitely times where I lost interest. But I think generally the conversations, the relatability of the conversations and the normalness of the conversations worked really well. Overall, I feel like it was a good narrative. It was really well written. But I do think the way that it's written is catered towards more of a mature audience who are perhaps maybe reminiscing about their younger days, rather than a teen audience. So I'd be interested to hear from a younger audience. If you're a teen audience, young adult, were you able to relate to it 100%? Were you 100% engaged? Did you feel like it was made for you? Because I feel like there was times where I felt like I couldn't relate to it, or I was unsure if I was the audience as a young adult. So yeah, let me know. I think overall the cast, the characters did a really excellent job bringing these characters to life. Really well acted, very well directed, very strong performances throughout. Even the smaller roles were acted very well. The character development was on point for most of the characters. Daisy Edgar Jones as Marianne was great, and Paul Mescal as was great. The chemistry between them was great. I really couldn't fault the cast, to be honest. But I'd be interested to hear from people who have read the book. Did you feel like the cast did the characters in the book justice? Another interesting aspect of the film, I think, that everyone is probably going to notice, is the style that the sex scenes are shot in. I think it was a very interesting style. They do a lot of close-up shots, especially close-up. Yeah, I think it was definitely an interesting style. I think it's definitely one of the more realistically shot sex scenes that I have seen, and it didn't seem vulgar. And even when we got the full-on nudity, I think obviously initially it's going to be like, okay, there's a full-on penis on my screen, but I was definitely here for the way that it was shot. I think because I often feel like generally in sex scenes it's always just the woman actor's body that is on exhibition, but it seemed very equal in terms of what we saw from the women actors, what we saw from the man actors, and it was refreshing. And obviously the dialogue and the conversations that they had about consent as well were great, and it didn't really feel very cheesy or forced either, because I feel like sometimes it can feel a bit like forced, like, okay, they're putting in a consent sequence in here now. It felt very organic to me, which I appreciated. But what did you guys think of the sex scenes? Did you like them? Did you feel like there was just a bit too much nudity going on? What did you guys think? But yeah, overall the cinematography was great. Like, it was a very beautifully shot series. The landscape that was captured, the juxtaposition of class. Miriam comes from a rich family. Connor is working class. The juxtapositions that they had from their different living environments. So when we saw Miriam's house, it was a wide landscape shot to show how big her house and, you know, and how affluent her family is. But then when we saw Connor's house, it was just a very tight shot to show, you know, he lives in a modest abode. Same with the kitchens. That juxtaposition shot, beautifully done, very subtle to show their class differences without even having to say anything. So those little juxtaposition shots that we had, those were shots that I noticed and I was just like, oh, I like those. I love the soundtrack. I like the cover music that was in it. Generally, cover music I'm not a big fan of, but I did like the covers that they had in there. I'm definitely going to look up the soundtrack and see who's covering what, because they're pretty decent covers in my opinion. Obviously, it's a 12-part drama and each of them are near enough like 25 to 30 minutes long. And I think it took around 6 hours for me to finish the whole series. So it's not that long of a binge. I do think it does drag a bit though. I feel like they definitely could have chopped off an episode or two or maybe even more, because I do think it was just a tad too long. But overall, I feel like it was a good solid season. If you were a fan of the book, I can only imagine that you would be a fan of the TV series as well. I don't think it will be for everyone though. Like I said, it does get very depressing. It does get very dark. If you're somebody who doesn't like to watch depressing stuff or stuff that is going to make your heart feel heavy, because my heart was definitely heavy at the end, this might not be for you. This might not be for you. The film has a good amount of realism in it, and if you're somebody who kind of likes more of a dramatic, sensational type of teen drama, again, this series might not be for you. This series might not be for you. And I also suspect that some people may not be able to find it engaging enough to commit to 12 episodes, because there was a few areas in the series, specifically in the second half of the series, where my interest started to wane a little bit. You know, my eyes started to wander towards my phone a little bit, towards my phone a little bit. But I think overall, if you're somebody who likes well-written, realistic drama, doesn't mind getting a little bit emotionally deep, leaving a series with your heart heavy, that's well acted, I definitely thoroughly recommend this series. So I think, taking everything into account, I'm going to give this a very strong 3 out of 5. I think it was a very solid series, but I do think it was just a little dragged out. And I did find my interest waning in some parts, so that's the reason why. So yeah, if you haven't watched it, let me know if this is something that you were or are interested in watching. And if you have watched it, do let me know what you thought of the series. Let me know what you thought of my review, and let me know what you would rate it out of 5. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and if you have, don't forget to press that notification bell so you know when the next review is dropping. Till next time, guys, bye.